Welcome to House of History. In a study of the relationship between Frederick William, the soldier king, and his son Frederick the Great, it is written that the dominant attitude of Frederick's father molded the once effeminate and gaily frivolous young crown prince into the most feared and respected monarch of his day. I believe this is spot on, and after this video, hopefully you will as well. Their relationship is an incredibly tragic story of a gifted young boy that suffered tremendously at the hands of his military father in the war that was waged with immense emotional and psychological intensity between the two. Welcome to the complete history of Prussia. In the previous videos, both chronicling the reign of Frederick William, the soldier king, and the relationship between his father and himself, we have seen that it wasn't particularly rare for the Hohenzollern family to have a less than great relationship with their parents. Frederick I, king in Prussia, is described as a vain and luxurious loving man, whereas his son, the soldier king, was the polar opposite. As he ascended to the throne in 1713, he cut short everything that resembled the luxurious court life held by his father, and during his reign, he built the Prussian army to a disproportionate degree that instilled fear and awe among his friends and foes. It would be this army that his son Frederick II would use to earn himself the epithet the Great. Now, this video isn't about that. It is about the relationship between the soldier king and his third son Frederick. I say the third son because the soldier king's first son died in infancy due to a volley that was fired too close to his crib. His second son died during a baptism because the royal crown was too heavy for his little head and crushed his skull. Absolute grisly business. In 1712, young Frederick II was born to the soldier king and his wife, Queen Sophia Dorothea of Hanover. Basically, from the moment Frederick could walk and talk, he became the source of frustration and anger for his already hot-tempered father. The little kid showed an obvious affinity for French culture, was frivolous and weak, and could perhaps even be described as somewhat feminine. The greatest fear of the soldier king had come true. His son was basically a replica of his own wasteful and vain father, and the great inheritance he would leave him, an incredible army and strong Prussian state with filled coffers of gold, was in the king's eyes going to waste. Frederick preferred playing the flute over hunting and reading books over drinking beer with his father. He did take after his grandfather, with the exception that young Frederick was much smarter and thus much more dangerous, both to himself and his father. After all, his quick wits and sharp rhetoric was often rewarded with severe beatings. The fact Frederick would talk back to his father made the situation worse. After all, the soldier king had made sure that, while he despised his own father, he had always respected him and obeyed him. His son wasn't only resembling everything he loathed, but actually had the audacity to talk back to him. The fear that everything the king had worked for would fall apart once his son ascended can be understood by looking at what Frederick was like during his youth. The boy was anything but a soldier. He often fell off of his horse and was afraid of shooting. He made a lethargic impression with messy hair and staying up late. He enjoyed being alone reading novels. The king as a child was an absolute nuisance and very blunt. He could not relate to little Frederick at all, once saying, "I know for sure that he does not think as I do." In order to deal with his child, the king subjected young Frederick to a disciplined, near torturous daily routine. Christopher Clark writes that a letter from an imperial ambassador, Count Friedrich Heinrich von Seckendorf, when Frederick was 14, details that. The crown prince, despite his young years, looks as elderly and stiff as if he already served on many campaigns. And that isn't too strange. His daily routine was timed to the minute, with council meetings, county visits, military inspections, and educational obligations. These restrictions and obligations only deepened Frederick's resentment towards his father, and the boy became adept at opposing him with subtle irony in everything he said and did. The king was not intellectually on par with his son anymore, and could not deflect the rhetorical subtle jabs. As Frederick reached late puberty, towards the outside world he accepted the rigorous routine of his father, but in secret he had a personal tutor, Duhan, collect vast amounts of French books, with subject matter ranging from political theory to philosophical novels. He started learning the flute and composing his own songs. The king realized that his son was leading a double life, so to say, and the beatings and public humiliations only increased. As the king grew older, he started to suffer from physical ailments such as migraine, gout, and stomach cramps, driving the already easily aggravated man close to madness. In his Tabakskollegium, the unofficial cabinet filled with old military men, as we will see in the video about that, he complained that it seems that Frederick, is ashamed of his father. When between 1725 and 27 there were negotiations to marry Frederick and his sister Wilhelmine off to English nobility, Vienna decided to secretly intervene. A rift between the Prussian king and son was very favorable to them. An Anglo-Prussian alliance wasn't something Vienna would be happy with. Several members of the Collegium were on the payroll of Vienna, and as such, many members of the Collegium encouraged the soldier king in his rage and disappointment towards his son. As a matter of fact, it wasn't uncommon that the kid was brought before the men at night, most of them drunk and surrounded by fumes from the smoke, together with the king. They would berate him and laugh at him. The fact the young Frederick hated smoking and drinking seemed the least of his worries during those times. The king's wife and Frederick's mother was actually in favor of marrying him off to an English princess. As such, two factions started to emerge, the pro-Vienna and pro-English faction. Frederick, who did have a good bond with his mother, was drawn into the English camp, while the king was afraid of a rift with Vienna, and thus opposed the English marriage. Eventually, the king prevailed. The intrigues and fights that characterized this affair are too many to sum up, but the animosity Frederick felt towards his father was only exacerbated by it, and eventually played a major role in his decision to flee, a decision that led to one of the most grisly affairs of the entire dynasty. Considering this horrible situation, it isn't too surprising that Frederick thought anything was better but to stay at his father's court. In 1730, at the age of 18, the king and Frederick attended an army parade where a dispute between the two arose. The king took it upon himself to publicly humiliate Frederick and beat him. The latter, utterly humiliated, decided he was going to leave Prussia. Now, Frederick was very close friends with Hans Hermann von Katte, a 26-year-old son of a Prussian field marshal. The two shared a love for poetry and the flute. He confided in von Katte his plans to flee to France, with von Katte initially trying to change his mind but eventually helping him. Together they mapped out Frederick's escape attempt. It ended in utter tragedy, with the plot discovered and both men arrested. Initially, both were thrown in prison at Kustrin, where the great elector had resided during the worst years of the 30 Years' War, nearly a century earlier. The prosecution of the men was detailed meticulously and stored in Prussian archives in the aftermath. Co-conspirators and friends of Frederick, they suffered under the king's vengeance. Two companions were thrown in jail. A 16-year-old girl Frederick had flirted with was whipped through the streets and incarcerated for several years. And then there was the main conspirator, Hans Hermann von Katte. He was sentenced to life in prison at first, but the king wanted to make an example of him. Considering his actions high treason, he overturned the verdict by the court and sentenced him to death. What followed was one of the tragedies and most grisly scenes of the soldier king's reign. Frederick was forced from his prison window to watch the execution of his friend. His guards were ordered to hold his face against the bars. As Katte was beheaded, the king is said to have said, "There shall be justice, even if the entire world were to collapse." Before von Katte was executed, Frederick had already fainted. The body and decapitated head of von Katte was left in front of the window until late afternoon. After the execution of von Katte, Frederick finally submitted to his father. He never defied him, and although the relationship was cold and distant, Frederick started to mold himself more towards a stoic military man. The energetic, curious, and perhaps naive Frederick had been killed. His later writings reflect that overt cynicism and mocking became his way to deal with things. Considering the circumstances, it was probably a self-defense mechanism to overcome the trauma he suffered. In a letter written nearly 30 years after the event, Frederick wrote that it had made such a profound impression on him that after ascending to the throne, he spent days reading the documents pertaining to the case. After having read them, he tore up the pages that he did not want the world to see, sealing the rest and placing them in the court archives. As for the passions he had as a child, even as a crown prince, he now firmly dedicated himself to military matters and government affairs, considering himself, just like his father, the first servant of the state. By 1740, he even endured, for lack of a better word, the marriage his father wanted him to have. It was a loveless marriage with Elizabeth Christine of Brunswick-Wolfenbüttel-Bevern. He didn't see his wife except for formal occasions, something he announced already in 1732. If I am forced into marriage with her, she will be rejected. He kept his word until his death, passing away childless 46 years later. As Frederick married, the king had fallen very ill and was rapidly nearing his death. He was bloated, his illness got worse, but as his body worsened, his attitude towards his son changed. Shortly before his death, the king told Frederick that he had a Frederick William in him. As Bakshian remarks in his essay, this is kind of the reverse of inside every fat man there is a thin man struggling to get out. But nevertheless, it was meant as a compliment. Approaching his death, the king took pleasure in watching his Potsdam Giants regiment parade in front of his window and amateur carpentry. Some folklore claims that the king even built his own coffin during his final weeks. To his sister, Wilhelmine, Frederick confided that he would be miserable as long as their father was alive. Yet, as the king's death was approaching, Frederick was struck with grief, stating that he never knew he loved him so much. In letters to Voltaire, Frederick described the last meetings with his father, the discussing of state affairs, and the courage with which his father faced death. The king's last days on earth were spent dictating regulations for the stocking up of grain reserves and his own funeral. On the 31st of May 1740, Frederick William I, the soldier king, passed away. At his funeral, his regiment of Potsdam Giants gave their final salute, before now King Frederick II disbanded them. Disbanding this regiment saved the crown enough expenditures for Frederick to recruit 10,000 more soldiers to an already overwhelming Prussian military apparatus. From his father, he inherited nearly 100,000 soldiers at the ready, putting Prussia on par with great powers, not to mention the weapon and ammunition arsenals. As for European politics to the south, within 5 months of Frederick's ascension to the throne, the Habsburg Emperor Charles VI passed away without a male successor. His daughter, Maria Theresa, was left to control all Habsburg dominions. It was then Frederick decided to put the army he inherited to the test. He seized all of Silesia within 6 weeks, later reminiscing about the affair. Ambition, self-interest, and the desire to hear my name spoken outweighed other considerations. This invasion was perhaps Frederick's greatest feat of his entire 46-year-long reign. Next video, we will delve into the reign of Frederick the Great, the self-styled philosopher king, the wars he fought, and the expansion of Prussia. If that sounds interesting, consider subscribing to my channel. Thank you very much for watching this video. Make sure you check out the entire playlist of the history of Prussia if you haven't already. I would also like to thank all my patrons for their generous support. If you enjoy House of History and want to support my work, consider checking me on Patreon. For just $1 a month, you will gain access to the exclusive Patreon series. Don't forget to subscribe. See you next time.